Chapter 6. A victorious roar came from within a crater in the ruins of Tokyo. A king was dead, and another alive. The vanquisher of Megaguirus had now also vanquished Godzilla 2000, whose corpse lay motionless and headless. Even Godzilla's pride could acknowledge that it was the almost chance that he was alive and his opponent dead. The scratch to his neck had been Godzilla 2000's undoing, for while his scales and spines had weathered the explosion well, that single open wound in a critical area had exposed his innards to the destructive force the two of them had unleashed. The shockwave and the flames had forced their way into the relatively tiny injury, forcing it open and shearing off the head of the once mighty king. Still, he would take no chances. He stood over the corpse and absorbed its remaining radiation, giving himself a much-needed surge of power and removing any hope that Godzilla 2000 would rise again. He scanned the area and saw two of the Leviathans battling in the distance, and a pair of Gojirahkiin closer to his size, not quite as far away. He marched forward. One battle was over. It was time to go to war. Godzilla struggled against his reanimated father. The battle had taken them to the edge of the ruins created by the earlier clash of the beams, and they dealt with vast skyscrapers as a backdrop. The abomination smelled of his kin, but was something else entirely, and for that it would die. He forced the pretender back and blasted it with his atomic ray, the ensuing explosions hiding the imposter from view. A moment, the pretender's own atomic ray emerged from the smoke, striking Godzilla's scar. He screeched in pain and backed away under the assault. The false Godzilla charged out of the cloud, aimed a pair of claw slashes at the weakened flesh, drawing blood. The undead kaiju continued its attack, biting Godzilla's neck and squeezing, intending to crush his windpipe or rip out a major artery, whichever came first. Godzilla let out a muffled roar of defiance. He charged his atomic ray, but could not fire it with his throat constricted. Worse still, one of his claws had been pinned by the proximity of the false king, unable to strike back. But all was not lost. He looked down and saw that his free hand was on the same side as his foe's eye wound. He swung his arm as high as possible and dug his claws into the empty socket. With a shriek of agony, the demon recoiled from him, rolling around and swiping his legs out from beneath him with its tail in its haste to get away. With his throat no longer obstructed, Godzilla fired his breath weapon at the back of his foe's head, making him stagger and ultimately fall forward. The scarred king took the opportunity to get to his feet, seeing his foe trying to do the same. He fired it's back again, making it stagger forwards. As the mockery turned to face him, Godzilla eyed. It's not as an enraged and vengeful son, but as a predator. Unlike all the other Godzilla on the battlefield, its wounds were not healing. They remained open, bleeding, as its hide was covered in burns and cuts. But in some places, it appeared thinner than in others, And at that moment, he understood. Whatever had reanimated his father could not even do it properly. The abomination's hide was not strong, merely thicker than normal. It truly was a pale imitation of the real thing. With greater understanding and renewed determination, he challenged the false king again. Two enormous mutants now fought in the heart of Tokyo, once a bustling metropolis, now a ghost town, filled only with the sounds of angry roars and falling buildings. The first Godzilla was the one that had been the Cold War's third superpower, hunting the nuclear submarines belonging to both the US and the USSR. It had been considered such a threat that an entire task force, the G-Force, was created by the United Nations and granted nearly unlimited fundings to destroy him. Every attempt had failed. The other, leaner Godzilla, had been deemed too aggressive, too dangerous, and had been sealed away in the Antarctica, buried beneath a glacier, and a giant freezer built around his icy tomb to keep him there. He had only been unleashed when an alien invasion had destroyed much of the world, to destroy the monsters in the alien armies. In mere days, he had destroyed nearly all the lesser monsters, and almost single-handedly destroyed the invaders. They were both unstoppable forces, now directed at each other. They charged one another, the larger with greater mass, the smaller with greater momentum. There was a thunderous boom as they crashed against one another, and for a long moment seemed to be in a deadlock, roaring at one another and grappling, trying to throw each other off balance. Despite this, it was less comparable to a sumo wrestling and more like watching a pair of natural disasters in conflict, like an erupting volcano being struck by a tsunami, or a rock slide being caught in a tornado. Sparks flew as the claws raked against each other's hide, attempting to rip apart scales as hard as diamonds. The leaner mutant bit his bulkier doppelganger, who snarled in irritation. He was forced once again to use his nuclear pulse, which his opponent once again absorbed. If this continued, he would ultimately be drained of power, and his foe would be even stronger. It was time to end this. Drawing from a deep reservoir of rage and nuclear power, crimson light flashed across Godzilla's body and spines, and he unleashed the red spiral ray on his opponent at point blank. The rival Godzilla shrieked in pain and collapsed, the scales on his chest sizzling. None of his foes had ever had such power. Even Kaiser Ghidorah, mightiest of his foes, had merely been able to daze him before siphoning his power. Now, he was faced with an opponent who might truly be able to destroy him. But the Antarctic prisoner would not go quietly into the night. His attacker was not the only one with a red ray. Rising again, he slammed his tail and then both feet into the ground with enough force to penetrate the rubble and concrete, anchoring himself. Then he began charging his greatest power, his own spines flaring blue and then red. The red spiral ray met the spiral fire ray. The heat exceeded that of the sun. Stone, stone turned into lava, and the surrounding buildings melted. The few trees that remained instantly burned to ash, and the ash evaporated into vapor. Both Gojirahkiins burned within the center of the inferno, both pouring all of their power into maintaining the half of the beam struggle. But one was advancing. Marching through the molten streets, the larger king continued to fire his variant of the spiral ray. What a difference 10,000 tons made! That he was able to walk in fire, while his lighter foe struggled to hold his position. The smaller king thought his foe was suicidal. With every step he brought himself closer to the inevitable explosion and the withering heat. But the larger mutation had fought many foes, while his rival was sealed in the ice. Biollante, King Ghidorah, Mothra, Batra, Mechagodzilla, Space Godzilla, and Destroyer. Almost always he had been the underdog, either fighting a stronger foe or multiple foes at once. Now, in his mind, the tables had turned. He was fighting a foe smaller than him, one that had been unleashed on weak alien pets by a vengeful world, and who had no true experience in battle with a stronger opponent. With every step, Godzilla knew that he could trigger the explosion, but he knew that he could take it. He doubted his opponent could. So even as the heat made the first drops of flesh fall from his spines, he continued his relentless march to destruction. Whatever else happened, one of them would burn. Finally, the laws of physics could allow no more, and the inevitable explosion occurred. Sans the premium alpha predator, every Godzilla was born from atomic weaponry and held some fragment of its power. But this was the first explosion to be truly comparable to a nuclear weapon. Those far away from the heart of the city, such as the three smaller Godzillas on the coast, were able to endure the shockwave, but then the flames rushed over them. The shockwave cleared the rubble from the eldest Godzilla's tomb, but before he could stand, he was swept aside by the fire. Not even the ocean was spared. The sheer force of the explosion of the shockwave and the heat of the explosion forcing the surface of the ocean down and away from the shoreline. Were any structures still standing, they would have been toppled by the ocean. For lack of a better explanation, springing back with a powerful wave. By the time the light faded, night had fallen, and the mushroom cloud grown into a storm cloud that had blotted out the moon, casting the landscape in utter darkness. The only lights were flashes of lightning and the constant glow of the still molten ground. The clouds, seeded by so much radiation, released a poisonous black rain not seen in Japan since the detonation of Little Boy and Fat Man. But lightning tends to strike the tallest objects in a region, and there were several areas struck by more bolts than any others.